Nobody survives 8 plasma blades. The surgical drone whispered in a flat mechanical voice. Correction, this human did. Cold white lights reflected across the chrome ceiling of the medical chamber as Ethan Cole drifted somewhere between sleep and pain. The steady hiss of oxygen pumps echoed softly through the room, while rows of armored alien warriors stood completely still around his bed. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Their black-silver armor shimmered under the dim emergency lighting like statues carved from obsidian. One of them tightened her grip around the handle of an energy spear as she stared down at the unconscious human in disbelief. The monitors beside Ethan flickered wildly with unstable readings. Human biology was not supposed to survive trauma like this, especially not from military-grade plasma steel. A faint burn smell lingered in the air, mixing with antiseptic vapor and overheated circuitry. Ethan's chest rose weakly beneath layers of medical bandages, while robotic surgical arms continued sealing damaged tissue across his side. 8 separate cauterized wounds glowed red under the transparent biogel. 8 direct strikes. 8 times he should have collapsed. But he had stayed standing anyway. A smaller figure sat quietly beside the bed, almost hidden beneath the massive armored soldiers surrounding her. The child's pale blue skin looked almost silver beneath the hospital lights. She clutched a worn stuffed animal tightly against her chest, refusing to let go even now. Her large violet eyes never left Ethan's face. One of the warriors finally lowered herself to one knee beside the child. "Princess Lumi," she said carefully, her voice low and reverent. "The physicians require rest for the human." The little girl shook her head immediately. "No," her voice cracked from exhaustion. "If he wakes up alone, he'll think I left him." Silence filled the chamber again. None of the warriors knew how to respond to that. Beyond the towering windows of the station's upper levels, thousands of ships drifted through the darkness of space like silent stars. Patrol cruisers surrounded the medical tower in tight defensive formation while emergency broadcasts flashed across every military frequency in the sector. The lost heir of the Varen Empire had been found alive. But inside the room, none of that seemed important. Not the fleets. Not the Empire. Not even the war threatening to tear entire systems apart. Because on the hospital bed lay a tired human mechanic from the lower docks who had nearly died protecting a child he didn't even know. 12 hours earlier, Ethan Cole had been covered in engine grease inside docking Sector 12, arguing with a broken oxygen recycler that rattled louder than a dying air conditioner. The cramped repair bay smelled like burnt copper and machine oil, while rain hammered endlessly against the station's outer hull. His thermal jacket hung loosely over broad shoulders, already worn down by too many 14-hour shifts and too little sleep. "Come on," Ethan muttered as he slammed a wrench against the recycler housing. "Just hold together one more week." The machine answered with an ugly grinding noise before coughing warm steam directly into his face. Ethan sighed heavily and wiped his brow with the sleeve of his jacket. Another normal night on Vera 9. Another failing machine. Another paycheck that wouldn't cover rent. Somewhere overhead, freight haulers roared through the docking lanes with enough force to shake dust loose from the ceiling pipes. Ethan barely noticed anymore. After 6 years living on the station, noise had become part of the air itself. He reached for his battered metal coffee mug when something moved outside the repair bay door. Small. Fast. Frightened. Ethan frowned slightly. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Running. Ethan slowly set the coffee mug down beside the recycler console as the sound of running footsteps echoed again through the narrow maintenance corridor outside his repair bay. Fast. Uneven. Metal grates rattled beneath tiny shoes striking the floor at full speed. Then came something else. Heavy boots. Several of them. Adult voices barked sharp commands somewhere deeper in the corridor, distorted by rain and static from the overhead speakers. Ethan frowned and stepped toward the half-open bay door. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the smell of wet steel and engine exhaust from the docking levels below. For half a second, he saw nothing except flickering emergency lights reflecting across puddles on the floor. Then a tiny figure darted past the doorway. Ethan barely caught a glimpse. Pale blue skin, thin arms, bare feet. The child disappeared behind a stack of cargo containers at the far end of the hall. A moment later, 3 armored figures rounded the corner behind her. They were not station security. Ethan knew security uniforms. These men wore matte gray combat, plating with blank helmets that hid their faces completely. One of them carried a pulse baton glowing faintly red at the tip. Sector 12 is sealed. One voice snapped through a helmet speaker. The child cannot escape. Ethan immediately stepped back into the shadows of the repair bay before they noticed him. The armored men rushed past without slowing down, their boots thundering against the metal floor until the sound faded into the storm outside. Silence returned slowly. Ethan waited another few seconds before muttering under his breath, "Not my problem." He turned back toward the broken recycler. The machine answered with another ugly grinding noise before completely dying with a sad electronic chirp. The lights above his workstation dimmed. Ethan stared at the dead machine for a long moment. "You have got to be kidding me." Somewhere behind him, something shifted softly. Ethan froze. His eyes moved slowly toward the dark corner near the oxygen tanks. Two glowing violet eyes stared back at him. The child crouched silently behind a toolbox almost too large for her small frame. Water dripped from strands of silver-white hair hanging across her face. Her breathing sounded shallow and uneven like she had been running for miles. Ethan blinked once in surprise. Up close, she looked even younger than he expected. Maybe 8 years old. Maybe less. The oversized gray shirt hanging from her shoulders was torn near the sleeve, and one small hand clutched a worn stuffed animal tightly against her chest. Burn marks covered part of the toy's fabric. Neither of them spoke at first. Rain hammered against the station hull overhead while distant cargo engines vibrated through the walls. Ethan rubbed a hand across his tired face. "You picked the wrong place to hide, kid." The girl said nothing. Her glowing eyes flicked nervously toward the corridor outside. Ethan sighed quietly. "Are those people chasing you?" A small pause. Then one slow nod. Ethan looked toward the doorway again. He should report this. Station law alone could bury him in legal problems if he interfered with armed contractors. He already owed 3 months' rent. The last thing he needed was trouble involving alien factions. But the child looked terrified. Not dramatic. Not hysterical. Just exhausted in the way frightened children became after running too long without feeling safe. Ethan noticed her feet then. Small cuts marked the bottoms from running barefoot across metal corridors. "Damn," he muttered softly. He crouched beside an old storage locker and pulled out a thermal blanket still sealed inside plastic packaging. "Here." The child flinched when he moved closer. Ethan stopped immediately and lowered the blanket onto the floor between them instead of handing it directly to her. "Relax," he said quietly. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would not be offering blankets." For the first time, the girl spoke. Her voice was small and uncertain beneath the hum of dying machinery. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan leaned back against the toolbox and gave a tired shrug. "Because you look cold." The child stared at the thermal blanket for several seconds before finally reaching for it with slow, uncertain movements. Her small fingers trembled from cold as she wrapped the silver fabric around her shoulders. The blanket was too large for her tiny frame and nearly swallowed her whole. Ethan pretended not to notice the way she immediately relaxed beneath the warmth. He walked back toward the dead recycler and crouched beside the exposed wiring panel again. "You got a name?" he asked casually while tightening a loose connector with his wrench. The girl hesitated. "Lumi." Ethan nodded once. "Ethan." Silence settled between them again, filled only by rain striking the outer hull and the occasional groan of distant cargo freighters docking above the station. After a minute, the recycler coughed back to life with a rattling whine. Warm air slowly pushed through the vents. Ethan allowed himself a small satisfied smile. "There we go." Lumi watched him carefully from across the room. Not with fear anymore. Curiosity. The kind children had before deciding whether the world was safe enough to trust. Ethan grabbed his coffee mug again and immediately grimaced after tasting it. "Cold." He looked toward Lumi. "You hungry?" She lowered her eyes, but nodded once. Ethan opened the tiny storage cabinet beside his workstation. The inventory inside looked depressing even by station standards. Half a loaf of protein bread. One nutrition pack. Instant soup cups stacked beside cheap coffee cartridges. End of the week supplies. He sighed quietly and grabbed the last soup container anyway. "Lucky for you," he muttered while filling a heating kettle with filtered water. "I make terrible decisions." Steam slowly curled upward into the cold room as the kettle warmed. Lumi stayed silent the entire time, clutching the stuffed animal close while watching every movement Ethan made. The toy looked old and heavily repaired. One button I replaced with mismatched metal stitching. Somebody had cared enough to keep fixing it over and over again. Ethan noticed faint symbols burned into the fabric near its side. Not damage. Markings. Deliberate ones. Before he could study them longer, Lumi pulled the toy closer protectively. Ethan looked away immediately. Sorry. A loud metallic bang echoed somewhere outside in the corridor. Lumi froze instantly. Her breathing sharpened. Ethan quietly moved toward the bay door and lowered the security shutter halfway with a mechanical pull chain. The rusty metal screen slammed into place with a heavy clunk. The room became dimmer immediately. Only the orange glow from the recycler and the weak ceiling lights remained. Ethan returned holding the steaming soup container carefully. Here. Lumi accepted it cautiously with both hands. The warmth rising from the cup reflected softly across her pale skin. She stared down at the soup for a second like she had forgotten food could smell comforting. Then she took one tiny sip. Her shoulders loosened slightly. Ethan leaned against the repair bench and folded his arms. So who exactly are those people chasing you? Lumi lowered the cup slowly. Bad people. Ethan snorted softly. Yeah, I figured that part out. She looked down at the stuffed animal again before speaking very quietly. They said I belonged to them. Something cold settled in Ethan's chest at those words. He had lived on Vera 9 long enough to know what disappeared into the lower sectors sometimes. Smuggling, trafficking, black market contracts. Most people survived the station by pretending not to notice. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly and looked toward the shuttered door. Well, he muttered after a moment. They are going to be disappointed. Lumi blinked up at him. Why? Ethan shrugged lightly. Because right now you are hiding in my repair bay. For the first time since arriving, the child smiled. It was tiny, fragile, but real enough to make Ethan feel strangely uncomfortable in his chest. Like somebody had handed him responsibility he never asked for. Outside, thunder rolled across the station hull again, while somewhere far above them, patrol sirens began to howl through the rain. The patrol sirens continued wailing somewhere beyond the station walls long after midnight settled over docking sector 12. Ethan sat on an overturned supply crate near the recycler while a diagnostic scanner blinked lazily across his workbench. The tiny repair bay glowed with soft amber light from old machinery, turning the room warmer than the freezing corridors outside. Lumi had fallen asleep curled near the back wall beneath the thermal blanket, her stuffed animal tucked tightly beneath one arm. Ethan glanced toward her every few seconds without realizing he was doing it. Children did not belong in places like Vera 9, especially not alone, especially not hunted. He rubbed both hands over his face and leaned back with a tired sigh. This entire situation already smelled dangerous. Maybe worse than dangerous. Expensive. And expensive problems always found ways to crush people like him first. The old station clock above the workbench flashed 2:14 a.m. in faded red numbers. Ethan stood quietly and grabbed another blanket from storage before walking carefully toward the sleeping child. Lumi barely stirred when he draped the extra layer over her shoulders. Up close, he could see exhaustion written all over her small face. Dirt streaked across her cheeks beneath strands of silver-white hair, and faint shadows rested beneath her glowing violet eyes. She could not have been running for just a few hours. This looked like days. Ethan stepped back slowly, but something metallic caught the light beneath the blanket folds near her neck. A chain. Thin silver links. At the center rested a small circular pendant no larger than a quarter. Ethan frowned slightly. The symbol engraved into the metal looked familiar somehow. Sharp lines branching outward around a central star. Elegant. Precise. Definitely not cheap. He had seen markings like that before on cargo manifests passing through upper sector customs. Government shipments. Diplomatic vessels. Military escorts. Money. Serious money. Ethan immediately looked away and muttered under his breath. Nope. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with wealthy alien politics. Rich people started wars over symbols like that. A soft crackle suddenly burst from the overhead speaker mounted beside the bay door. Attention residents of lower docking sectors. Temporary security lockdown remains active until further notice. Citizens are advised to report all suspicious activity immediately. Ethan rolled his eyes. That usually means somebody important lost something. The speaker hissed again before cutting out. Silence returned except for the hum of ventilation pipes and distant thunder outside the hall. Ethan sat back down near the workbench and reached for his tools, trying to focus on normal things again. Loose wiring. Broken relays. Bills. Problems he understood. But every few minutes his eyes drifted back toward the sleeping child. At some point near 3 in the morning, Lumi stirred suddenly beneath the blankets. Her breathing quickened. Small frightened sounds escaped her throat as she twisted restlessly in her sleep. Ethan frowned and stood. "Hey," he said quietly while kneeling beside her. "Kid, you are okay." Lumi's eyes snapped open instantly. For one panicked second, she looked ready to run again. Then she saw Ethan and slowly relaxed. "Bad dream?" he asked. She nodded weakly. Ethan sat against the wall beside her without speaking. The room stayed quiet for a while. Warm air drifted softly through the vents overhead. Finally, Lumi spoke in a sleepy whisper. "Why do humans help strangers?" Ethan gave a tired laugh under his breath. "Most do not. But you did." Ethan stared toward the rain streaking down the tiny window beside the ceiling pipes. He thought about saying something clever, something wise. Instead, he shrugged. Somebody should. Lumi looked down at the stuffed animal in her lap. Back home, they said humans only care about themselves. Ethan smirked faintly. Yeah, humans say that about humans too. The child looked genuinely confused by that answer. Ethan chuckled quietly for the first time all night. Then suddenly 3 heavy knocks slammed against the metal security shutter outside the bay. Both Ethan and Lumi froze instantly. A distorted voice echoed through the corridor speaker. "Maintenance worker, open the door." The voice outside the shutter carried the cold confidence of somebody used to being obeyed immediately. "Maintenance worker, open the door now." Ethan stayed perfectly still beside Lumi. The little girl had gone pale beneath the dim lights, clutching the stuffed animal so tightly her knuckles almost glowed white. Another knock slammed against the metal shutter hard enough to shake dust loose from the ceiling pipes. Ethan stood slowly and motioned for Lumi to stay quiet. He crossed the repair bay carefully while wiping grease from his hands onto his jacket. Every instinct told him this was the exact moment sensible people stopped getting involved. He reached the security shutter and pressed the speaker switch mounted beside it. "Shop is closed," he called out flatly. "Come back tomorrow." Silence followed for half a second. Then the distorted voice answered again. "We are searching for a missing child." Ethan leaned against the wall beside the control panel and glanced briefly toward Lumi hiding behind the workbench. "Congratulations," he replied dryly. "You just described half this station." The corridor outside went quiet again. Ethan could hear muffled conversation between several people beyond the shutter. Heavy boots shifted against the floor grates. One of them sounded impatient. Another sounded nervous. Finally, the speaker crackled once more. "The child is dangerous." Ethan almost laughed at that. Dangerous. The tiny, exhausted girl wrapped in 2 blankets barely looked capable of lifting a toolbox. "Kidnapper handbook says that too," he muttered under his breath. "What was that?" the voice snapped. Ethan straightened slightly. "I said I have not seen anybody." A pause. Then came the sound of something sliding across the floor outside. A small metallic case appeared beneath the narrow gap under the shutter. Ethan frowned and crouched carefully beside it. The case popped open automatically with a soft hydraulic click. Inside rested stacks of polished credit chips glowing blue beneath the room lights. More money than Ethan had seen in years. Maybe enough to finally leave Vera, 9 forever. The speaker crackled again. "You are a working-class human with outstanding debt history and expired docking permits. We are offering compensation in exchange for cooperation." Ethan stared silently at the credits. Rain hammered the station hull overhead, while warm air hissed softly through the recycler vents behind him. The numbers flickering across the chips reflected in his tired eyes. Paid rent, medical insurance, real food, a transport ticket off the station. For one dangerous second, the offer felt painfully tempting. Then Ethan looked back toward Lumi. The child sat completely frozen beside the workbench, watching him with wide, terrified eyes. Not hopeful, not trusting, terrified, like she already expected the world to choose money over her again. Something heavy settled quietly inside Ethan's chest. He looked back down at the credit case and slowly pushed it away with his boot. "Not interested," he said. Silence answered him immediately, the kind of silence that felt colder than threats. "Human," the voice finally replied. "You do not understand the situation." Ethan folded his arms. "That makes 2 of us. The child belongs to powerful people." Ethan nodded slightly. "Yeah, I figured that out around the giant armored psychopath part." One of the men outside stepped closer to the shutter. "You are making a mistake." Ethan rubbed a tired hand across his jaw and looked toward the dim ceiling lights overhead. "Probably." Then he reached over and cut the speaker connection entirely. The repair bay fell silent again except for the rain and distant thunder rolling through the station. Ethan stood there for several seconds, staring at the closed shutter while his heartbeat thudded slowly in his chest. Outside, the boots remained in the corridor for another minute before finally retreating into the distance. Lumi still had not moved. Ethan walked back toward her and sat down heavily on the crate beside the wall. Well, he muttered softly. That was definitely the wrong financial decision. Lumi stared at him quietly. Why did you not take the money? Ethan gave a tired shrug. Because people willing to pay that much for a kid are usually the reason the kid is running. The child lowered her eyes slowly. Her voice became almost too quiet to hear. They will come back. Ethan looked toward the security shutter again. The old metal suddenly felt very thin. Yeah, he admitted softly. I know. Morning never truly existed on Vera 9. The station only shifted from dark artificial lighting to slightly less dark artificial lighting, while freight traffic increased overhead and exhausted workers dragged themselves toward another cycle. Ethan sat beside the repair bench, drinking burnt coffee from a cracked metal mug, while the recycler rattled steadily behind him. He had not slept at all. Every sound in the corridor made his shoulders tense automatically now. Lumi remained curled beneath the blankets near the back wall, still asleep for the first time since arriving. At some point during the night, she had moved closer to the recycler vent where the warm air circulated strongest. The stuffed animal rested beneath her chin. Ethan quietly stared into his coffee. This was bad. Worse than bad. He knew enough about station life to recognize when powerful people were involved. Men with military hardware did not search lower docking sectors personally unless something extremely valuable had disappeared. And children were never valuable for good reasons. A sharp electronic chirp interrupted his thoughts. Ethan looked toward the old terminal mounted above his workbench. The screen flickered weakly before displaying a red overdue notice across the cracked monitor glass. Final payment warning. Docking debt collection pending. Ethan sighed heavily and rubbed his eyes. Perfect timing. He closed the notice with an irritated tap. The terminal immediately opened another message. Security alert. Sector 12 temporary curfew in effect. Report suspicious individuals for financial reward. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. The reward amount flashing on the screen was even higher than last night. Somebody was getting desperate. Behind him, Lumi stirred awake quietly. Ethan glanced over as the child slowly sat upright beneath the blankets. Her silver-white hair looked messy from sleep, while faint confusion crossed her face for half a second before she remembered where she was. Then she immediately looked toward the security shutter. They came back? She asked softly. Ethan shook his head once. Not yet. He stood and grabbed another soup container from the shelf. His last one. Breakfast. Lumi hesitated before nodding carefully. Ethan poured water into the heating kettle while she sat quietly watching him from the blankets. The room smelled faintly of steam and machine oil again as warm air drifted through the vents overhead. Strange how quickly another person changed the feeling of a place. 24 hours ago this repair bay had only felt lonely. Now it felt tense. Alive. Fragile. Ethan handed Lumi the heated soup container and sat back down across from her. The child warmed her hands against the cup before speaking quietly. You should leave me somewhere else. Ethan frowned slightly. Why? Lumi lowered her eyes. Because they will hurt you if they find me here. Ethan leaned back against the workbench with a tired exhale. Kid, people have been hurting me for free my whole life. I am not about to start charging admission now. Lumi blinked in confusion again. Ethan smirked faintly. Human joke. She stared at him for another second before a tiny smile appeared despite herself. Then it vanished just as quickly. My mother used to say jokes are for safe places. Ethan looked at her carefully. Where is your mother? Silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that answered questions before words ever could. Ethan immediately regretted asking. Sorry, he muttered softly. Lumi shook her head slowly. I do not know if she is alive. The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Ethan looked toward the shutter while his jaw tightened slightly. Whatever this situation was, it had become much bigger than station criminals chasing a runaway child. Before he could respond, a sudden flicker of movement appeared on one of the old security monitors mounted near the ceiling. Ethan stood immediately and turned up the screen brightness. 3 armored figures had entered the corridor outside the repair bay again. But these were not the same men from before. Their armor was darker, cleaner, sleek black metal lined with silver markings that glowed faintly beneath the station lights. One of them removed her helmet slowly. A woman. Pale gray skin, white eyes, sharp features completely without emotion. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. These people looked military in a way the others never had. Precise, controlled, dangerous without needing to prove it. On the monitor, the woman lifted her gaze directly toward the security camera. Then she spoke softly into a wrist communicator. The child is here. Ethan stared at the security monitor while the woman outside continued studying the camera with unsettling calm. The silver markings along her black armor pulsed faintly beneath the corridor lights, like living circuitry. Two more armored figures stood behind her completely motionless, their helmets hiding every trace of expression. They looked less like soldiers and more like something engineered specifically for war. Beside the monitor, Lumi had gone completely silent. Ethan looked down at the child and immediately understood something had changed. Fear was still there in her eyes. But now there was recognition too. You know them, Ethan said quietly. Lumi nodded once, very slowly. The Astra Varangard. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. Even the name sounded expensive. Dangerous. Official. The woman on the monitor stepped closer to the shutter and spoke in a calm, measured voice that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. Human, open the door. Ethan folded his arms, starting to notice everybody on this station really likes giving orders. The child is under our protection. Ethan glanced toward Lumi again. The little girl lowered her eyes immediately. That was not the reaction of somebody who felt protected. Ethan looked back at the monitor. Funny, he replied. She looked terrified when she saw you. Silence answered him for a second. Then the woman removed a small metallic device from her belt and held it toward the security camera. The symbol glowing on its surface matched the pendant Ethan had seen around Lumi's neck. Sharp silver lines surrounding a central star. His stomach tightened immediately. That symbol, he muttered quietly. What exactly is going on here? The woman's pale eyes remained fixed on the camera. The child carries authority greater than you understand. Ethan gave a tired laugh. Lady, I repair oxygen filters for a living. I barely understand my rent payments. One of the armored soldiers behind her shifted slightly, clearly irritated by the conversation. The woman raised one hand subtly without looking back. Instant stillness returned. Ethan noticed that immediately. Discipline-like, that did not come from ordinary security forces. Lumi stepped closer beside him, clutching the stuffed animal tightly against her chest. Please, she whispered. Do not let them take me. Ethan looked down at her. Why? Lumi hesitated. Her glowing violet eyes trembled slightly. Because if they find me, other people will die. Ethan frowned deeply. Before he could ask another question, warning alarms suddenly erupted across the station. Red emergency lights flashed violently through the corridor outside, while automated voices echoed overhead. Security breach detected in lower docking sector 12. Unauthorized armed personnel identified. The woman outside immediately turned her head toward something farther down the corridor. For the first time since arriving, her expression shifted slightly. Concern. Then the sound came. Heavy footsteps. Fast. Loud. Not 3 people this time. Dozens. Ethan's heartbeat instantly quickened. Through the monitor, he saw another group rushing into the corridor from the far intersection. Gray armor. The same men from before. Weapons drawn openly now. The entire hallway exploded into chaos without a single shot fired. Workers fled screaming through the corridors while warning sirens echoed endlessly through the station. The woman in black armor looked back toward Ethan's camera immediately. Open the door now, she ordered sharply. They are here for her. Ethan glanced between the monitor and Lumi. The child looked frozen with fear. Whatever choice existed before had just disappeared. Another loud metallic impact echoed somewhere nearby hard enough to shake the repair bay walls. Dust drifted from ceiling pipes overhead. Ethan swore under his breath and moved quickly toward the storage shelves beside the workbench. Kid, he said while grabbing an old thermal jacket and shoving tools aside. You know another way out of this sector? Lumi nodded quickly. Maintenance tunnels below the cargo rails. Good. Ethan pulled open a rusted floor hatch near the recycler unit, revealing a narrow service ladder descending into darkness beneath the station. Warm air carrying the smell of oil and old machinery drifted upward immediately. Another impact thundered outside, louder this time. The woman on the monitor drew a long silver energy blade from her back with a sharp electric hiss as the corridor behind her erupted into flashing lights and shouting voices. Ethan looked toward Lumi and pointed toward the ladder. Go. But the child did not move. Her frightened eyes stayed locked on him instead. What about you? Ethan forced a crooked smile despite the pounding in his chest. I am the idiot who owns the repair shop, he muttered. Somebody has to slow them down. The repair bay trembled violently as another impact slammed through the corridor outside. Warning lights flashed red across the walls while emergency sirens screamed overhead without pause. Ethan grabbed a heavy steel pipe from beside the workbench and shoved a storage crate against the security shutter with a loud scrape across the floor. It would not hold for long. He knew that, but maybe long enough. Lumi stood frozen beside the open hatch leading into the maintenance tunnels below. Warm air drifted upward around her silver hair, while fear shimmered openly across her glowing violet eyes. Go, Ethan said again more firmly this time. Now. The child shook her head immediately. I cannot leave you. Ethan gave a tired laugh despite the chaos outside. Kid, I appreciate the loyalty, but this is not really the moment for emotional speeches. Another metallic crash exploded through the corridor. The security monitor flickered wildly as sparks erupted outside the bay entrance. Through the static, Ethan caught brief flashes of black armor moving against gray armored attackers beneath the strobing emergency lights. The woman from the Astra Vanguard moved with terrifying precision, her silver energy blade cutting bright arcs through the smoke-filled corridor while civilians fled in panic behind her. Ethan had no idea who the good guys actually were anymore. He only knew one thing for certain. Lumi was terrified of being caught, and terrified children did not deserve to be handed over like cargo. The security shutter suddenly dented inward with a heavy boom. Ethan stepped backward instinctively. Okay, he muttered under his breath. That is definitely not ideal. Lumi clutched the stuffed animal tightly against her chest. They will destroy this place. Ethan looked around the repair bay. The rusted shelves. The leaking pipes. The recycler that barely worked half the time. His entire life fit inside this tiny room of broken machinery and unpaid bills. Strangely, he felt almost nothing about losing it. Honestly, he admitted softly, this place has been trying to fall apart for years. A voice suddenly echoed through the speaker system beside the shutter. Not the cold, controlled woman from before. A different voice. Rougher. Impatient. Human. It barked sharply. Deliver the child, and you walk away alive. Ethan rubbed one hand across his face. You know, he muttered loudly enough for the speaker to hear. The customer service on this station keeps getting worse. Another impact struck the shutter immediately afterward. The metal buckled inward farther this time. Lumi flinched hard at the sound. Ethan looked toward the hatch again. Time was gone now. Listen to me, he said while kneeling in front of her. You climb down this ladder. Follow the left tunnel until you reach cargo rail 7. Do not stop for anybody. Understand? Lumi stared at him with wet, frightened eyes. What about you? Ethan forced another crooked smile. I am going to make some very bad life choices. Before Lumi could answer, the security shutter suddenly tore open halfway with a deafening screech of twisting metal. Smoke rolled into the repair bay beneath flashing red lights. Several gray armored figures appeared through the opening immediately. Ethan stepped forward without thinking. Instinct. Pure human instinct. One of the intruders moved toward the child. Ethan shoved the heavy steel pipe across the opening hard enough to force them backward again. The impact rattled painfully through his arms. More shouting echoed from the corridor outside, while sparks burst from damaged ceiling panels overhead. The repair bay lights flickered violently. Lumi stared at Ethan in shock. He was outnumbered, completely outmatched. Just a tired mechanic standing between trained fighters and a terrified little girl. And somehow he still refused to move aside. Go! Ethan shouted finally. This time Lumi obeyed. The child scrambled down the ladder into the darkness below while clutching the stuffed animal against her chest. Ethan waited until he heard her feet disappear into the tunnels before turning back toward the shattered doorway. The gray armored men stepped forward again. Behind them, through smoke and flashing lights, the woman in black armor suddenly appeared at the far end of the corridor. Her white eyes locked directly onto Ethan, then onto the open hatch behind him. For the first time since this nightmare started, Ethan saw real alarm. Across her face, she understood exactly what he had done. Ethan tightened his grip on the steel pipe while the station alarms screamed around him. Yeah, he breathed heavily. That kid is not staying here. The corridor outside the repair bay dissolved into flashing red light, smoke, and screaming alarms while Ethan stood alone in front of the open hatch with nothing except a steel pipe in his hands and exhaustion weighing down every muscle in his body. The gray armored men moved carefully now, spreading across the shattered doorway while sparks rained from damaged ceiling panels overhead. Somewhere deeper in the station, another explosion rumbled through the walls hard enough to shake loose rust from the ventilation ducts. Ethan's heartbeat pounded heavily in his ears. He could still hear Lumi climbing through the maintenance tunnels below. Still moving. Good. That was all that mattered. One of the gray armored figures stepped forward slowly. You cannot protect her forever, human. Ethan tightened his grip on the pipe. I only need 5 more minutes. The armored figure tilted his head slightly. Why? Ethan almost laughed at that question. Why? Like kindness needed a business plan. Like protecting a frightened child required strategy. Ethan glanced briefly toward the dark hatch behind him before answering quietly. Because somebody should. The figure raised a weapon slowly. Before anything else could happen, a silver blur suddenly crossed the corridor. The woman from the Astra Varan Guard slammed into the gray armored soldiers with terrifying speed, forcing them backward away from the doorway. Energy blades flashed bright white against the smoke, while warning sirens screamed louder overhead. Ethan staggered backward instinctively as the corridor erupted into chaos again. The woman turned sharply toward him. The child, she demanded. Where is she? Ethan breathed heavily against the edge of the workbench. Blood from a deep cut along his side soaked slowly through his jacket now. He had not even noticed when it happened. Safe, he answered simply. The woman stared at him for one long silent second. Then her gaze shifted toward the open hatch. Relief flickered across her face so quickly Ethan almost missed it. More impacts thundered through the station around them. The woman touched 2 fingers against the side of her helmet. Seal every cargo rail exit. She ordered through her communicator. The princess is alive. Ethan blinked slowly. Princess. The word barely registered through the ringing in his ears. You people seriously need better introductions, he muttered weakly. The woman stepped closer now, lowering her weapon completely. Up close, Ethan could finally see exhaustion beneath her cold, controlled expression. Fear too. Real fear. You protected her, she said quietly, almost like she still could not believe it. Ethan leaned heavily against the workbench as dizziness rolled through him. Yeah, he muttered. Turns out I am very bad at minding my own business. Another violent tremor shook the repair bay. Ceiling lights burst overhead in showers of sparks while smoke flooded through the damaged doorway. The station was beginning to fail around them. The woman immediately grabbed Ethan before he collapsed completely. Medical teams are inbound, she said sharply. Ethan barely heard her anymore. His vision had started blurring at the edges. Somewhere through the smoke and flashing lights, small footsteps suddenly echoed across the corridor. Lumi. The child emerged from the maintenance tunnel entrance farther down the hall, with tears streaking across her pale blue face. Ethan, she cried. The woman beside him looked genuinely shocked. Princess, you were ordered to evacuate. Lumi ignored her completely and rushed toward Ethan instead. The little girl wrapped both arms tightly around his waist despite the blood staining his jacket. Ethan winced softly but managed a weak smile anyway. Hey kid, he whispered. Thought I told you to keep running. Lumi shook her head fiercely while clutching the stuffed animal against him. I do not leave people behind. Something inside the corridor changed then. Every black armored warrior from the Astra Varan Guard who entered the repair bay stopped moving the moment they saw the child holding onto the wounded human mechanic. Silence spread through the smoke-filled room despite the alarms still screaming overhead. One by one, the elite warriors lowered their weapons. Then slowly, with perfect discipline, they bowed their heads toward Ethan Cole. Not to a king, not to a soldier, just a tired man from docking Sector 12 who had chosen to protect a frightened little girl when nobody else would. Ethan looked around the ruined repair bay in complete confusion. Okay, he muttered weakly. That is new.